the circling pattern, spatial movement, and staging analysis. We've examined the biological clocks, lividity patterns marking hours, rigor mortis recording the passage of time and stiffening muscles. Now, we need to turn our attention to something equally revealing but far more subtle: the geography of activity in that house during those critical hours. When we map where things were found, where the ransom note was placed, where the pen and notepad were discovered, where other items appeared that seemed out of place, a pattern emerges. Not a random scatter of objects displaced by panic or chaos, but something more deliberate, a circling, a concentration of activity in specific zones of the house that whispers of movement with purpose, of someone traversing a particular path again and again during those hours between darkness and the call for help. This isn't evidence that announces itself loudly. It sits quietly in the police reports, in the photographs, in the floor plans. But once we see it, once we trace the invisible line connecting these points of activity, we cannot unsee it. Let's establish what we're looking at here. The house itself becomes evidence, not just the setting for events, but a record of movement, a map of where someone went and why. From a forensic perspective, we examine spatial relationships. We ask ourselves, where was the ransom note found? On the spiral staircase near the butler's kitchen. Where was the notepad that the note was torn from? In that same general area, near a small catch-all space by the kitchen. Where were the pens discovered? Again, in proximity to that zone. Where was the pineapple bowl with the spoon and tea bag? The butler's kitchen table. Where did the path from the main staircase lead if someone was moving between the upper floors and the basement? Through or very near this same concentration point. We're not talking about a house where evidence was scattered randomly across 15 rooms. We're talking about a tight clustering of activity, multiple significant items, multiple pieces of the puzzle, all within a relatively small area of a much larger home. And that clustering tells us something about how someone moved through that space during those hours. Theme 1. The butler's kitchen. Nexus, where everything converges. When we examine the layout of that house, we see that the butler's kitchen and the adjacent spaces function as a kind of crossroads. From an anthropological perspective, this makes sense. Kitchens have always been gathering points, places where family members naturally pass through multiple times throughout the day and night. But what we're seeing here isn't the normal traffic of daily life. We're seeing a concentration of evidence that suggests someone was operating from this zone as a kind of base during those critical hours. The ransom note was placed on stairs that are steps away from this area. The materials used to write that note, the pad, the pen, were found in immediate proximity. The food evidence suggesting she had been awake and moving through the house was sitting on the table in this kitchen. And perhaps most significantly, this area sits at a strategic point in the house's geography. It connects the main living spaces to the basement access. It's near one set of stairs leading to the upper floor, and it provides a natural pathway for someone moving between different levels of the home. Let's think about what this clustering means from a psychological standpoint. When people are under extreme stress, when they're operating in a state of panic or desperate focus, they tend to minimize their movements. They establish a zone of operation and work within it rather than ranging widely through available space. This is partially practical. Moving through multiple rooms increases the chance of being heard, of disturbing someone who might be sleeping, of leaving evidence in unexpected places. But it's also psychological. In moments of crisis, we seek to contain and control our environment, to limit the variables we're managing. So, if someone was staging a scene during those hours, if they were writing a note, positioning items, creating a narrative that would be discovered in the morning, they would naturally work from a central location that gave them access to everything they needed while minimizing the footprint of their activity. And that location, based on where evidence was found, appears to be this nexus around the butler's kitchen. From a criminological perspective, we need to ask ourselves, what would someone need to accomplish during those staging hours? And how would the geography of this zone support those needs? They would need to write the ransom note, a process that took time given the length and detail of that document. The notepad and pen were readily available in this area. They would need to place that note somewhere it would be discovered in the morning, somewhere that made sense in the context of the narrative they were constructing. The spiral staircase leading up toward the bedrooms was visible from the kitchen, a logical location for a note left by someone who supposedly entered the house and departed. They would need to move between the upper floor, where the bedrooms were, and the basement, where she would ultimately be found. The butler's kitchen sits along that pathway. They might have needed food, coffee, something to keep them alert during hours of work that likely stretched deep into the night. The kitchen provided that. Every element necessary for the staging process was within this concentrated zone. Now let's consider this from a philosophical angle. There's something revealing about how we move through space when we're trying to conceal truth versus when we're simply living authentically. Normal movement through a house is expansive, unself-conscious. We go where we need to go without thinking strategically about sightlines or evidence trails. But movement during concealment is different. It's conscious, calculated, minimized. We see this pattern in how the person responsible moved through that house during those hours, not ranging widely, but circling, returning again and again to a central zone where the elements of the staging were being assembled. This isn't speculation. This is what the physical evidence map shows us. And what it shows is movement that looks less like panic and more like process, less like chaos and more like someone working through a terrible checklist during the darkest hours before dawn. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about what sustained activity during those hours would have required. If someone was awake from roughly midnight or 1 a.m, around the time the neighbor reported hearing the scream, until 5:30 when the call was made, we're talking about 4 to 5 hours of activity. That's not a brief moment of panic followed by the call for help. That's sustained engagement with a complex task. The body, under that kind of stress, requires fuel. Adrenaline can sustain someone for a while, but eventually the system needs calories, fluids, something to maintain function. The presence of the pineapple bowl, the tea, these items in the butler's kitchen aren't just evidence of what she may have eaten. They're evidence of human presence in that space during those hours. Someone was in that kitchen. Someone was consuming something, or at least these items were out and available. And that presence in the kitchen aligns with all the other evidence clustering in this same zone. Let's shift to the logical implications. If we map the evidence locations and the necessary movements between them, we can actually trace a likely path. Upper floor, where the bedrooms were, down to the main level, through or near the butler's kitchen area, down to the basement. Then back up the same path. Perhaps multiple trips, discovering what had happened, going down to assess, coming back, up to think and plan, going back down, returning to the kitchen area to begin the staging process. Each circuit through this pathway would have taken the person past the zone where we find the concentrated evidence. And if they made multiple trips during those hours, which seems likely given the complexity of what had to be accomplished, this nexus point would have been traversed again and again. The circling pattern isn't random. It's the natural result of someone moving between the scene of what happened and the space where they were constructing the narrative that would explain it. From an anthropological perspective, we can think about how humans use space to process trauma and make impossible decisions. In many cultures, there are rituals around significant events, births, losses, transitions, that involve specific spatial movements, repeated paths that help the mind process what the heart cannot fully accept. What we're seeing here may be an unconscious version of that same impulse, the repetitive circling through a defined space while working through an unbearable reality. But layered over that psychological need is the practical necessity of staging. The person wasn't just circling to process, they were circling with purpose, accomplishing specific tasks at each point in the circuit. Writing the note, checking on what was in the basement, perhaps moving items, perhaps repositioning things, returning to the kitchen to think about what else needed to be done, going back down to implement those thoughts, each circuit adding another layer to the staging, each pass through the butler's kitchen area, leaving traces that would later be documented as evidence. So when we step back and look at the map of that house with the evidence locations marked, what we see isn't a house where chaos reigned. We see a house where activity was concentrated, where someone operated from a central zone that gave them access to everything they needed while containing the footprint of their movements. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, this clustering around the butler's kitchen area tells us something significant about how those hours unfolded. It suggests purpose rather than panic, process rather than random reaction. It suggests someone who, despite operating under tremendous stress, was able to think strategically about movement and evidence, to work from a position that minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. The butler's kitchen wasn't just where some evidence happened to be found. It was the nexus, the hub, the operational center for activity that spanned multiple hours and multiple areas of the house. And once we see that pattern, once we understand what it reveals about consciousness and capability during those hours, we cannot dismiss it as coincidence. Theme 2, the path of the note, tracing backwards to origin. We've established the concentration of activity around the butler's kitchen, and now we need to focus specifically on one element that sits at the heart of this case, the ransom note. Not what it said, we'll come to that, but where it came from and where it ended up. When we trace this object backward from discovery to creation, we find ourselves walking through that same concentrated zone we've been examining. The note was found on the spiral staircase. Where did it come from? The notepad was in the butler's kitchen area. The pen was found near that same zone. So we have origin point, creation materials, and final placement all within steps of each other. From a forensic perspective, this tight geographic relationship tells us something important. Whoever wrote that note didn't carry materials from one part of the house to another distant location. They worked where the materials were, or very close to it, and when they placed the note, they placed it within the same concentrated area where it had been created. Let's think about what writing that note would have required, psychologically and practically. This wasn't a brief message. This was 2.5 pages of detailed narrative, references to movies, specific dollar amounts, threats, instructions, even moments that sound almost conversational. From a psychological standpoint, producing that much text requires a certain state of mind, not the panicked scrawl of someone in acute crisis, but something more sustained, more controlled. Someone sat down, probably at the kitchen table or a nearby surface, and worked through the construction of this document. They had time to think about what to include, to reference films they'd seen, to create a narrative about foreign factions and attachés. This wasn't written in 30 seconds. Conservative estimates suggest it would take 10 to 15 minutes minimum, possibly longer if the person was thinking between sentences, perhaps restarting on other pages before arriving at the final version. That's significant time spent in one location, focused on a single task. From a criminological perspective, the location where someone chooses to write a staged ransom note tells us about their comfort level in that space and their assessment of risk. Writing requires focus, adequate lighting, a surface to work on, and, critically, confidence that you won't be interrupted or discovered mid-task. The fact that the materials were found in the butler's kitchen area and the note was placed nearby suggests this zone felt safe to the person responsible. They weren't worried about being discovered while sitting there writing. This implies either that everyone else in the house was truly asleep, or that the person writing had the authority or position to be in that space at that hour without raising questions if they were seen. It speaks to familiarity with the house, to knowing which spaces could be occupied during nighttime hours without seeming unusual or suspicious. Now, let's consider the philosophical implications of what the note's path reveals. We talk about the ransom note as if it were primarily about its content, what it said, what clues might be hidden in the language, whether the handwriting could be matched. But the note's physical journey through the house is itself evidence. It originated in materials found in a specific location. It was created somewhere, likely very near where those materials were stored. It was then transported a short distance to be placed on the stairs. Each of these movements required decisions: where to write it, where to get the materials, where to place it so it would be discovered, but in a way that supported the narrative being constructed. And the fact that all of these decision points cluster in the same small area of the house suggests that the person responsible was operating within a contained zone, not moving widely through the home, but working within a limited geographic boundary. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about the physical act of writing under stress. The body under acute stress hands shaking with adrenaline, perhaps sleep-deprived, possibly emotionally overwhelmed, would struggle to produce neat, controlled handwriting. And yet, portions of the ransom note show relatively steady penmanship despite the length and detail. This suggests either that the person wasn't in a state of acute physiological crisis while writing, or that they had the capacity to control their physical responses despite internal turmoil. Either possibility is revealing. If they weren't in acute crisis, it suggests a certain emotional distance from what had happened, an ability to compartmentalize enough to focus on the practical task of creating the note. If they could control their physiological responses despite distress, it suggests someone with significant emotional regulation capacity, someone who could make themselves perform a complex task even while processing trauma. Let's shift back to the logical sequence. Someone needed materials to write the note. Those materials were available in the butler's kitchen area: a notepad, a pen. This wasn't a situation where they had to search the house, going from room to room looking for paper and something to write with. The materials were immediately at hand in the zone where activity was already concentrated. This suggests either remarkable luck, that they happened to be in the exact area where writing materials were stored, or more likely that they were already familiar with where these items were kept. They knew the notepad was there. They knew pens were available in that small catch-all space. They didn't waste time searching. They went directly to where they knew materials could be found. That familiarity with the microgeography of the house, knowing exactly where a notepad would be stored in the butler's kitchen area, speaks to someone who lived there, who had internalized the location of everyday objects through repeated daily exposure. From an anthropological lens, we can think about how different spaces in a home carry different meanings and uses. The butler's kitchen, as a secondary kitchen space, would typically be used for specific purposes, perhaps preparing snacks, storing overflow items from the main kitchen, providing a space for quick meals or informal gathering. It's not usually a formal space, not where visitors would be entertained or where family would gather for major meals. It's utilitarian, practical, somewhat private. The fact that the staging materials were assembled in this kind of space, rather than in more public areas of the house, tells us something about the psychology of the person responsible. They chose a space that felt contained, less exposed, more under their control. They operated in a zone where presence wouldn't feel unusual, where sitting at a table writing in the middle of the night might feel less exposed than sitting in the formal dining room or the main living area. So, when we trace the path of the ransom note backward, from where it was found on the spiral staircase to where the materials originated in the butler's kitchen area to where it was likely written somewhere in that same concentrated zone, what emerges is a remarkably compact geography of activity. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the note's origin and placement tell us that someone worked within a limited space during those hours, that they had intimate knowledge of where materials were stored, that they felt comfortable enough in that zone to spend significant time there, engaged in a complex task, and that when they placed the note, they placed it close to where it had been created, rather than ranging through the house to find some more distant location. The circling pattern continues. The materials were there, the creation happened there, the placement was nearby, and all of it clusters around the butler's kitchen nexus that keeps drawing our attention no matter which thread of evidence we follow. Theme 3. The staging pathway, reconstructing movement through time. We've examined the nexus point and the note's origin, and now we need to attempt what investigators do when physical evidence tells a spatial story. We need to reconstruct the probable movement patterns during those hours. We're not claiming perfect knowledge of every step taken, every moment accounted for. But when we combine what we know about where evidence was found with what we understand about human behavior under stress, about the practical requirements of staging, about the time windows suggested by biological evidence, a probable pathway emerges, not with absolute certainty, but with enough clarity that we can begin to understand how someone moved through that house during the darkest hours, what sequence of activities might have produced the clustering pattern. We see what this movement pattern reveals about consciousness and purpose during those critical hours. Let's start with what we believe happened first, based on the neighbor's account of the scream around midnight. From a forensic perspective, if that scream represented a moment of acute distress, perhaps when she was harmed, perhaps when the situation escalated beyond control, then what would logically follow? Someone would need to assess what had happened. If the event occurred in the basement, someone would have gone down there, seen the situation, and faced an impossible moment of decision. From a psychological standpoint, this is where shock might have initially paralyzed rational thought. But eventually, shock gives way to desperate calculation. A parent discovering that one child had taken the life of another would be caught between immediate impulses: call for help, attempt impossible intervention, deny what they're seeing, and creeping awareness that calling for help might mean consequences they cannot accept for the surviving child. That moment of realization, whenever it occurred, marks the beginning of the pathway we're tracing. From a criminological perspective, once the decision to stage rather than immediately report has been made, certain practical necessities follow. The person needs time to think, to plan, to work through what story might be believable. Where would they do that thinking? Likely not standing in the basement where the situation was impossible to deny. They would need to remove themselves to create psychological distance. Coming up from the basement, they would naturally move through the main level, likely toward the kitchen area, both because it's along the path and because kitchens are where people instinctively go in moments of crisis. It's where we make coffee at 3 a.m. when we can't sleep, where we sit at the table and try to process overwhelming news, so we can imagine the person coming up from the basement. After that initial discovery, moving into the butler's kitchen area, sitting down, trying to make sense of what has to happen next. The pineapple bowl, the tea, these items might have already been there from earlier, or perhaps they were part of this process, something to occupy hands and mouth while the mind worked through impossible calculations. From a philosophical standpoint, there would have been a moment during these hours when the person shifted from reacting to planning, from being overwhelmed by what had happened, to actively constructing a narrative that might protect the surviving child. That shift marks the movement from tragedy to cover-up, from victim of circumstance to participant in concealment. And that shift would have required time, time for shock to subside enough that strategic thinking could emerge, time for the initial impulse to tell the truth to be overridden by desperate love for the living child and fear of what honesty would cost. During this thinking time, the person would likely have remained in the butler's kitchen area or nearby. They wouldn't have wanted to go back down to the basement more than absolutely necessary. They would have established this main level zone as their operational center and worked from there. Now, from a physiological standpoint, let's think about what the body requires during sustained stress and decision-making of this magnitude. The person would have been awake for hours, operating on adrenaline initially, but eventually needing some form of sustenance to maintain function. They might have made coffee, tea, something to keep themselves alert. They would have been moving between sitting while writing the note, while thinking, and standing, pacing perhaps, moving between the kitchen area and other spaces as different tasks required. This physical activity, the basic maintenance of the body during hours of crisis work, would have left traces, not necessarily obvious ones, but the kinds of traces that investigators look for. Items moved from their usual locations, evidence of food or drink consumption, wear patterns on floors from repeated pacing along the same path. The concentration of evidence in the butler's kitchen area might reflect not just where the staging materials were assembled, but where the person spent hours physically present while working through the terrible checklist they had created. Let's consider the probable sequence from a logical perspective. First, discovery of what had happened, likely in the basement. Second, the moment of decision, to stage rather than immediately report. Third, the thinking phase, sitting in the kitchen area, processing, planning. Fourth, the creation of the note, gathering materials that were readily available in that same zone, spending perhaps 15 to 30 minutes on the writing itself. Fifth, probably multiple trips back down to the basement, perhaps to check on something, perhaps to attempt some repositioning, perhaps simply because the mind in crisis can't stay away from the scene of trauma even when practical necessity doesn't require presence there. Sixth, the placement of the note, carrying it from the kitchen area to the spiral staircase, positioning it where it would be found, and throughout all of this, circling up and down between floors, into and out of the kitchen area, along the pathways that connected the upper bedrooms to the basement, with this main level nexus point sitting in between. From an anthropological perspective, we can see in this reconstructed pathway something that appears across human cultures: the ritual circuit. When people process grief or trauma, they often move in repetitive patterns, walking the same path again and again, visiting the same spaces, creating a kind of physical routine that helps the mind cope with overwhelming reality. But what we're seeing here isn't just unconscious coping movement. It's movement with purpose layered over that psychological need for repetition. Each circuit served a function, checking the basement, returning to think and plan, implementing the next phase of staging, going back to verify, coming up to write the note, placing the note, perhaps making final adjustments. The staging requirements and the psychological coping mechanisms merged into a single pattern of movement that lasted hours and left evidence clustered along its pathway. So, when we step back and look at the full reconstruction, the probable movement from basement to kitchen to stairs and back again, repeated through hours of darkness, What we see is someone working through perhaps the most terrible night of their life, while simultaneously attempting to construct a narrative that might protect what remained of their family. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the spatial evidence tells us this wasn't a brief moment of panic followed by an immediate call for help. This was hours of sustained activity, movement with purpose, someone circling through a defined pathway while accomplishing specific tasks at each point in the circuit. The clustering of evidence around the butler's kitchen, the concentration of activity in that nexus zone, the ransom note, materials, and placement, all within steps of each other. None of this is accidental. All of it reflects the geography of staging, the pathway someone traveled during those hours when biological clocks were marking time in the basement, while conscious minds worked frantically on the main level to create a story that might, just possibly, protect the one child who could still be saved. The house became a map of that movement, preserving in the location of objects and evidence the invisible trail someone left as they circled and circled through the darkest hours before dawn. We've walked through the geography of that house, traced the concentration of evidence around the butler's kitchen, followed the path of the ransom note from origin to placement, and reconstructed the probable movement patterns during those staging hours. What emerges isn't the chaos of an external intruder moving randomly through an unfamiliar house. What emerges is someone who knew that space intimately, who operated from a central zone that gave them access to everything they needed, who circled between floors along a predictable pathway, leaving evidence of their passage at every point along that circuit. The pattern was always there, sitting quietly in the police reports and floor plans. But once we see it, once we map it and understand what it reveals about familiarity, purpose, and sustained activity during those hours, we cannot unsee it. Next time, we'll continue following these threads, pulling at the loose ends in the narrative, examining the other elements that cluster around this same zone of activity, and asking ourselves what it all means for understanding what truly happened during those hours when staging became more urgent than truth.